So, hey, Atelier Ryza 3 is coming out soon, so what an excellent and timely time to talk about Atelier Ryza 2. While the Atelier franchise has managed to stick around for quite a while, and certainly has its fair share of fans, the release of Atelier Ryza nonetheless breathed a lot of life into it. So much so that it got a sequel, and that sequel is getting a sequel. You know, Atelier Sophie 2 came out earlier this year as well, but prior to Ryza 2 and Sophie 2, the last time that any Atelier game got a direct sequel was Atelier Iris, which was on the PS2. So yeah, suffice to say, it has been a moment. And the fact that these games came out, and the fact that we're getting a third Ryza game, this is all a pretty big deal. So, did Ryza 2 live up to the expectations set by Ryza 1's immense success? Is it worth playing the duology before Ryza 3 comes out? This review is super late, and I'm very sorry about that. Grad school kinda took over my life for a while, but once upon a time, Koei Tecmo supplied me with a review copy, so let me tell you all about it. The first question that you're probably wondering is how necessary it is that you've played Ryza 1 before jumping into Ryza 2. And the answer is yes, but. You know, the game opens up with a recap of the events of Ryza 1, because Ryza 2 takes place 3 years later, and to a certain extent expects that you're familiar with other characters or story beats. So basically, it's not necessarily the end of the world if you jump into Ryza 2 without having played Ryza 1, but it definitely helps. So if you can play Ryza 1 before jumping into Ryza 2, I would definitely do it, but there's no need to sweat it too hard if you just can't for whatever reason. Anyways, so with that out of the way, Ryza 2. So, like I just mentioned, it takes place 3 years after the first Atelier Ryza. The game opens up with Ryza arriving in a big city, and you soon find out that it's to do some research on a magical orb. You see, in the 3 years since the first game left off, Ryza has continued with alchemy while her friends are out traveling and doing their own thing. And in fact, that's what brought her to this city. The fact that her old friends Tao and Boss are there, though of course by the end of the game you'll have made plenty more friends, both old and new. In any case, pretty soon the egg hatches into some magical creature thing. I don't know, you know, to me it just looks like an anime mascot from the 90s or early 2000s, but I digress. It hatches into some kind of magical creature, so you spend the rest of the game traveling around, trying to learn more about it. Like the first Atelier Ryza, this means that you'll visit a wide array of different environments, and along the way you'll have to fight monsters, collect items for alchemy, you know, pretty typical Atelier fare. But just because it's a typical Atelier game in this way and in other ways, doesn't mean that it doesn't set itself apart in others. The most obvious being that traveling and exploration is much simpler, and there's also just way more to explore. Yeah, a lot of emphasis has been placed on exploration, more so than in most other Atelier games. Most areas are going to require multiple visits and thorough investigation, not just for gathering materials, but also for research and progressing the plot. And because there's just so many cool areas and dungeons to explore, while this can sometimes feel like a chore or make you sick of seeing the same enemies over and over again after a while, more often than not, it's still pretty fun. But yeah, to go ahead and get back to exploration, even just small things like letting the player swim make it feel like a whole new world. And the research component that's added to the game, and that's just where you look for fragments throughout the area that you can input into these texts, which are in their own menu. It's honestly a lot simpler than I'm making it sound, I swear. Anyways, this process tells you more about the history of the areas, and it honestly adds a lot of flavor to the game. By the end, it actually ended up being one of my favorite additions, and I really hope that we see this again in Ryza 3. In addition to this emphasis on exploration, there's also a few other differences in Ryza 2, but they're the kind of differences that you'd more or less expect in a new Atelier game. Streamlined combat, for example. Yeah, new elements have been added to the combat system, which make it flow faster, yes, but it definitely takes some getting used to. And then of course the alchemy is also reworked slightly, but it's still basically the same at heart, just streamlined. That being said, though, my favorite of these more expected differences in Ryza 2 is definitely the characters. It's always fun to see returning characters show up in Atelier games, but I think it's especially fun in Ryza 2 because the game emphasizes that the characters have grown a lot since the first game, and, well, if you've played the first game, seeing their development is just a really fun experience. The new characters are fine too, of course, but I have a much bigger soft spot for the group in the first game. So yeah, all in all, Ryza 2 feels like a pretty elevated Atelier experience. There's definitely a few nitpicks I have with it, but no major complaints. Like I said, the new combat, although it definitely streamlines things, it does take a moment to get used to, and it does kind of make me yearn for a more simplified turn-based experience like Final Fantasy X or Persona. And the story, while it's not bad, it's still just not quite as engaging as that of some of the other Atelier games. In any case, if you enjoy Atelier games, generally speaking, you're gonna enjoy Ryza 2 as well, point blank. It maintains a good balance of typical Atelier charm while streamlining a few things. Good characters, good dungeons, good story, good game overall, I'd say. I wouldn't call it my favorite of the recent Atelier games. I still think Sophie has that spot as far as I'm concerned, but it's still really solid, and I'd say that I liked it more than the first Ryza game, and I'm pretty excited to play the upcoming third entry. And again, if you're new to Atelier and wondering if this is a good jumping in point, I mean, theoretically, yeah, I guess you can jump in with Ryza 2, but if you can play Ryza 1 before this, then you should. We don't know yet whether or not familiarity with Ryza's 1 and 2 is going to be necessary for 3. I don't think it will be, just because Atelier's track record in general is usually that familiarity helps, but isn't 100% necessary, but as of when this video is being posted, we just don't know for sure. But yeah, to go ahead and get this wrapped up, Ryza 2 was pretty enjoyable, just as Ryza 1 was enjoyable. So if things continue at their current pace, something that Atelier has a very long history of doing, then Ryza 3 will probably also be, yeah, I bet you can't guess what word I'm gonna use, enjoyable. So, in conclusion, God, I really hope this means we get a Sophie 3. Honestly, I wouldn't mind if Atelier Lady and Swell got a sequel too. That one was also really good.